There's never been more Christians in the world, there's never been more churches in the world, and there's never been more large churches in the world. So you have on the one hand Christians in the church, and on the other hand you have this immense brokenness.
Many of the areas where we're working, trying to see people come out of poverty, we aren't seeing transformation. I was kind of frustrated with that. I was like, how are we going to see transformation?
We aren't lacking in good content or even in necessarily good theology. We're lacking much more in the action upon those.
I think that the church around the world, it's hungry to see an answer to that question of why. Why haven't we seen transformation?
My first trip to Europe was very traumatizing for me because I came out of a situation where our local church in Nairobi was expanding and we were building up a sanctuary to accommodate literally thousands of people. When I went to Oxford for a conference, I was shocked to see the number of empty cathedrals that there were. A number of them were not even used for worship on a Sunday. And I began to question, because the gospel message was brought to us in Africa, particularly in Kenya, by missionaries from England. And I asked myself, is there something about this gospel message that has an expiry date? Why is it that here in this continent the churches are empty and in Africa the churches are flourishing? And I wondered, is there something about this message that could cause us to, in 50 years from now, to be shutting down the churches that we're building?
We were doing research in Namibia and trying to find the church and to build a database to find out what is the whole church about. How many denominations, how many organizations, how many local churches. But then also to do research to find the peoples and the places in Namibia where we need to go. And it became clear after we've researched the peoples, but 72 people groups living within the borders of Namibia, that although they heard the gospel, it didn't really brought cultural transformation. It didn't bring lasting life change. And that raised a question for us. If the gospel is really the power unto salvation, and people groups, although they heard the gospel, didn't really change because of that. They still worship their ancestors. They still do these things. Is there a problem with our message?
The problem that we're addressing in DNA is that the church really has an incomplete understanding of what God's intentions are for her and for her role in advancing His kingdom. And until that understanding becomes much more clear, and she's given some tools to be able to fulfill the calling that God has for her, she'll never be able to accomplish it.
I began to work in the world of poverty and began to see all the money that had been being spent around the world to try and help the poor, and how very little impact all that money was having. And I began to think, is there something else that's at the root of poverty besides lack of material resources? And over the years I came to the conclusion that the answer to that question was yes. Truth and lies are the critical substance for the development of a nation, the development of a community, or the poverty of a community.
I think that the church around the world, especially not here in the West, but in other places of the world, it's hungry to see an answer to that question of why. Why haven't we seen transformation?
The Disciple Nations Alliance is essentially it is an alliance of churches, of organizations, of individuals that have come together for a common purpose. And that purpose is to equip the church, local churches, to rise to their full potential in blessing and healing and restoring broken nations.
At DNA, we are absolutely theologically convinced that the church, and especially the local church, is the primary instrumentality that God has chosen to reveal His cosmic agenda in our world.
We realize that the church is God's primary organization for bringing about transformation in communities and nations.
Our principal resource is just a set of messages related to biblical worldview, the power of truth for transformation in a community, holistic ministry, the kingdom of God, God's plan to redeem all things broken through the fall. We offer those teachings through vision conferences, seminars, books, really any way that we can to get those ideas out, but probably a key method has been the vision conference.
I was completely changed by that conference, and I remember realizing that this is what the missing link has been in the church in Africa, because we've focused a lot on the spiritual things and on going to heaven, but very little on how to live life here on earth. And I remember coming up to Darrow and putting my hands on his shoulder and telling him, I'd like to give the rest of my life to see this message go throughout Africa. And as I look back over the last 10 years, I've really seen God literally do that.
The power of the DNA for getting these ideas out has been through what we call champions. We hold the messages and the teaching very freely, and it seems like as we've gone out and done vision conferences and done trainings, God has touched people's hearts in those venues, and they've said, hey, this isn't a message that my nation needs, my community needs. Train me, teach me, prepare me to be a deliverer of these messages.
I had the great hope of being able to find maybe 10 churches that would partner with us, and I thought that was kind of an ambitious goal, but within maybe a year and a half, God had 300 churches. We've now expanded to over 700 churches. We've got 250 communities that we are graduating. And the reason that they're graduating is because they say we have no more poverty in our community. So they are going out to the surrounding communities to help them, to lift them out of poverty.
I really think there's a movement happening right now as this generation of people are being equipped and resources like the DNA's teachings are becoming available, that they're going deeper into it, saying this makes way more sense than this message I heard before that I was told was so spiritually significant yet didn't play itself out in my everyday life, nor could I make the connection of seeing that there's a gospel of the kingdom, that God cares about communities and souls being transformed.
In a very, very dry, impoverished community, we've seen families changed dramatically, and it's become such a model that we've been having people from all over the continent, literally, coming over to see what's actually happening.
We haven't come in and done projects, we haven't done anything like that. All that we've done is given the church this teaching and just watched what God has done through the church as they've applied it.
This message brings a vision for the kingdom of God. And if there's one thing that we need in the time that we are living, is a message for the kingdom. Because the kingdom is the only message worth living for and worth dying for.